Hi, welcome to Effective Persuasion. Persuasion is the act of causing people to believe or do something. Now, we can see the influence of both persuasion and manipulation in business, politics, and advertising. Persuasion contrasts with manipulation in some very important ways. For our purposes today, we're going to be talking about ineffective persuasion because in academic work, manipulation is not effective. So, although manipulation can be very persuasive, it is not effective academically speaking. So we want to draw that distinction. And we'll talk about those differences as we progress. So, persuasion might have many roles. With persuasive language, you can change beliefs or refute claims. And here's an example of how one might do that. Blood donation is not dangerous, and a healthy adult can safely donate a pint of blood every 8 weeks. That might change a belief or refute a claim. One might also use persuasive language to reinforce a view. For instance, this statement, blood donations save lives. 4.5 million Americans would die each year without them. The second part of that statement, 4.5 million Americans would die each year, reinforces the first part of that statement. One might also use persuasive language to actuate or call the audience to action. And for example, you could say something like, every person who is physically able should donate blood. This prescribes a call to action. Now, all of these functions can be partly accomplished by using propositions of different kinds, and we'll discuss those. You might see persuasion in daily life. You might persuade various people who you deal with on a daily basis. For instance, you might persuade your supervisor that you need and deserve a raise. You might do that with a few different sort of persuasive sentences. One might be, my family needs the money. Another might be, I've earned it by being present, on time, and productive. Another might be, you might go to the data. You might say, according to the Department of Labor, the prevailing wage for this job is a certain amount, right? You might appeal to your supervisor's emotions. You might make a logical argument, or you might consult a source. All of these correspond to different types of persuasive tools. And you might think of other examples of how persuasion can help you in important life events. Maybe you have to persuade your spouse or your children or your coworkers of something. These can all be examples of different types of persuasion. We propose things when we persuade. We might propose a fact, right? Propositions of fact state that something is true, real, or reasonable. And here's an example. Blood donation saves lives. This is an example of a proposition of fact. The speaker is stating that a given thing is factual. And facts can be tested, right? They can be fact-checked for accuracy. Another type of proposition might be a proposition of value. And propositions of value state that something is valuable or worthless, fair or unfair, right or wrong. And propositions of value are sort of comparisons. You can compare things to accepted standards and establish the relative worth, fairness, or merit of people's beliefs or actions or policies. Here's an example of a proposition of value. Blood donation saves lives, and human life is precious. That phrase, human life is precious, addresses the value proposed in this statement, right? It enhances that persuasive statement by applying value to its outcome. There's also propositions of policy. Propositions of policy advocate for a specific course of action on various different levels. It could be on the governmental level, maybe just on the organizational level, and policies can also be advocated for on the individual level. So governmental processes are widely adopted, right? For example, the state of Illinois requires that all cars must be registered and have license tags. This policy can be defended or attacked on the basis of its value or reasonability or both. Organizational policies might apply to workplace rules or courses of action at work, a product to back or a supplier to use or a vendor to get rid of or different things like that, right? Individual policies might apply to votes or a choice of pet, anything that an individual decides. So those propositions of policy function at various levels. Here's an example of a proposition of policy. Everyone who is physically able should give blood. So this is an example of an individual or a personal policy. Proposition of policy. Now, all of these propositions can combine for a purpose. And when a speaker or a writer uses these purposed statements, they're involved in what we call rhetoric. Rhetoric can simply be defined as the persuasive aspects of language. Now, many of our politicians and business people have misused these persuasive techniques. They've done so for so long and so badly that lots of people have come to equate the word rhetoric with the word lies. So when someone says, oh, that's just rhetoric, that's almost a way of saying, well, that's just a lie of some kind. And this is not really true. This isn't the real definition of rhetoric. Rhetoric is a tool that can be used to create arguments that expose and emphasize the truth. In fact, rhetoric is a way of truth-telling, viewed from a very proper perspective. Now, because it's a tool, like any tool, rhetoric can be misused by people who are purposely trying to mislead, or by people who don't understand how to use this valuable tool properly. Rhetoric can be used to constructively change an audience's perspective on important matters. And this is very important in nearly every walk of life. Now, this can be accomplished through proposing those different points of view, right, of fact, of value, and of policy. So rhetoric is really just purposed, persuasive language that's related to an audience for a certain effect. Now, we talk about proofs in rhetoric. Theorists and teachers might talk about Aristotle's proofs, and that is ethos, pathos, and logos. While propositions can be persuasive, they don't really just stand alone. There's an interactive aspect that is described by the concepts ethos, pathos, and logos. Now, ethos is how the audience perceives the rhetor. We might refer to a rhetor every now and again in our talk. That really is just the speaker or the writer. That's the person who is using rhetoric. That's the rhetor. Okay. Ethos applies to the credibility, character, trust, goodwill, and identification with the audience that the speaker is able to generate during his or her talk or during the course of his or her paper. Now, ethos is a form of approval, which isn't necessarily based on the soundness of the logic that's presented or the emotional impact of the issues. Okay. Ethos is a form of qualification or agency. When you ask a question about ethos, the answer to that question can be, is this person qualified to speak or write on this subject? How is the speaker qualified to comment on these things? Now, ethos can also apply to one's data, to the credibility of the sources that one is referencing when you're talking or writing about a given subject. And there are different kinds of sources. it's important to note for academic work, you might hear from time to time this word primary source versus secondary source. Now, a primary source is close to the information, close to the source of the information, right? The primacy of sources can be compared to witnesses of an event. So you can imagine a schoolyard fight. I think everybody's seen one at one time or another in grade school when you were growing up, or in high school, maybe even you might have seen a fight break out on the playground or on the football field or something like that. The ring of people directly surrounding the fight, right? There's always people who watch that fight. The ring of kids right around the fight are close to the action. Okay. When those people who were close to the action describe what happened to other people, they possess a primacy or a proximity to the information they're relating that no one else can possess. People behind them aren't going to be able to see as well, and the people behind them aren't going to be able to see the events as well. Now, sources can be compared to this. The primacy of sources can be compared to proximity to the action. Okay, so for example, when a study is conducted and a paper is written by the experimenters who conducted the actual research, the source is primary. Okay, that source is closest to the events which comprise the information. Anyone else, like a journalist or analyst of another kind, who writes about the research from a second-hand perspective would be called a secondary source. Now, both primary and secondary sources can be reviewed or not reviewed. And when sources are reviewed, they've been looked at by other people who are trained in a similar discipline or the same discipline as the science that's studying something. So if a historian or a political scientist is looking at events that they're studying and they publish on that basis, other historians and political scientists will look at that research and confirm whether it's sound or they might condemn it for being unsound. When a source passes that review process, it's then thought to be reviewed. And when you search on the library database functions, and when you search for sources, you can tell whether or not those sources are reviewed in a few different ways. And a librarian can help you do that. Now, there are also secondary sources that can just be reputable. Like the New York Times is probably more reputable than the New York Post. While both are newspapers, the Times is a sort of a more serious organization that carries a little bit more gravitas, right? It carries a little bit more credibility than the Post, which is a little bit more sensationalistic. Now, you might also have approved sources from your instructor that just fit the bill in terms of their needs. So they may approve a source for your use, and then it's perfectly fine. And that can differ from instructor to instructor. Now, if you have questions about that, you should definitely confirm what sources are approved for use with your instructor. Now, another of Aristotle's proofs, right, these interactive aspects of rhetoric, is pathos. Now, these are emotional appeals to the audience, which hopefully create an emotional state in the audience that enhances the message. Now, you might brainstorm certain emotions that you would want to feel as someone is imparting a message. If you're inspired, that's different from being angered, isn't it? If you are called to action because you're inspired to change something that you think is wrong, you might have a form of anger that is actually constructive. It might motivate you to change something that's bad. Now, most of the time when we look at pathos as an effective mode of persuasion, we want to concentrate on the positive emotions that create positive change. Now, it's worthwhile to note that pathos is best used in concert with logos and ethos. And recall that ethos is that credibility that's bestowed, right, by the right sources and the right qualification. Now, everyone might remember an appeal that was made on behalf of an animal shelter. It's been around for quite some time. It shows images of suffering animals in different states of maybe they're very thin, they've been starved, they might have injuries that have gone untreated. Those types of images appeal very directly to our sense of pathos. They create an emotional state where we feel, we almost feel what the animals are going through in a way, and it can motivate action. The Sarah McLachlan song that accompanies the video for the animal shelter can further evoke certain emotions, and that's very effective. The campaign that used those images brought in $42 million during its first wave. So it can be very effective in persuading people to contribute to a cause or to do something. Now, logos is the last of the proofs we'll talk about today, and that's an appeal to reasoning and logic. And there are different kinds of reasoning and logic that you might hear about. You may hear about induction. Now, induction is accomplished when one observes specific things over time and then reaches general conclusions. And when we think about induction, we usually think about the scientific method. When an experiment is done over and over again, and we observe certain things happening, we can properly induce that there is going to be a certain outcome. It makes sense that we can draw reasonable conclusions. We can sort of predict what's going to happen next based on reasonable observation. Okay. Now, deduction is sort of the opposite concept. And an example of deduction that doesn't work follows. Penguins are black and white. Some old TV shows are black and white. Therefore, some penguins are old TV shows. Now, that doesn't quite work, right? Well, this is because we've reached a conclusion that is based on unsound premises, right? Our premise is wrong. Therefore, our conclusion is wrong. So deduction is a process that uses sound, general concepts to evaluate specific examples. And then the conclusion there is based on that observation. Okay. Now there's a third type, it's called abduction. Abduction describes a process where all the impossible or unreasonable explanations for a given phenomenon are eliminated, and what remains is correct. You may be familiar with that from Sherlock Holmes if you've ever read that. In Sherlock Holmes, in the movies and in the books and so on, they do call that deduction. That is actually incorrect. It is abduction that describes that process where all the unreasonable explanations are eliminated. What remains is correct. Okay. So to review, ethos is the credibility and authority of the rhetor, the speaker or the writer, that's imparted by sources and qualification. Pathos is the ability of the rhetor, speaker or writer, to induce a persuasive emotional state in the audience. And logos refers to sound argumentation and logic. Now, we talk about ineffective persuasion. It can easily be called, and I think rightly be called, manipulation. Now, there are certain fallacies that are engaged when a speaker or a writer is trying to manipulate his or her audience. And these have names. There are many of them. We'll cover a few. Some of the main ones you might see would be cherry picking, hasty generalization, post hoc, circular argument, the either or, ad hominem, or ad populum. And some of these Latin terms exist from ancient days. There are different ways you can refer to them, but we'll explain each one. Now, fallacies, it's important to note, these are all fallacies. All these fallacies are arguments which are frequently used because they can be very persuasive, but they don't stand up to inspection. Using them can be highly effective in persuading people to buy into your propositions, but when they're examined, they fall apart. They don't really work. Now, recall that we're concerned with effective persuasion, right? Not effective manipulation. That manipulation should always be avoided. So we'll give some examples of the fallacies. Cherry picking is something you might see quite a bit. That's using only data that supports a given view while suppressing data which doesn't support it. Suppressing or ignoring data that doesn't support a given view, right? And here's an example. All immigrants should be suspected of crimes because there are examples of immigrants who have committed them. Now, the reason this doesn't work is because this ignores important evidence. Not all immigrants have committed crimes. Most are law-abiding and hardworking. This can be compared to picking only specific cherries. It's like reaching out and picking a cherry out of a bunch. Picking only specific data and then generalizing on that basis is the flaw in this reasoning. This example picks a few examples of crimes committed and ignores a vast amount of the opposite phenomena. Now, a similar fallacy to cherry picking, but it's slightly different, which you might see a lot, is the hasty generalization. And this is using insufficient limited data to arrive at a wide-ranging conclusion. And here's an example. When I went scuba diving in the ocean last year, I didn't see any whales. Therefore, there are no whales in the ocean. Now, this doesn't work, does it? That's because we can't possibly know anything about whales on the basis of one person's anecdotal report at one time in one small part of a huge field of possibilities. The sample size just isn't big enough. In statistics, they would say that that survey lacks power. Right? Now here's another fallacy, the post hoc fallacy. That assumes that events which occur in sequence are causal of one another. And here's an example. It said in the paper that ice cream sales at the beach were the highest ever yesterday. I also read that drowning deaths were the highest yesterday too. That means that eating ice cream before swimming is dangerous. Now, this doesn't work either, does it? This is sometimes called the third variable problem. And this conflates cause with correlation. Because the events occur in sequence, the fallacy here, the lack of logic, is that they are causal of one another, and this is not true. They might correlate, but they are not causal of one another. It's also sometimes called the third variable problem in science. Here's another fallacy, the circular argument, which is a fallacy that occurs when someone is bringing in no new information into an argument, yet repeating a given idea as if repetition establishes its logical soundness. Here's an example. Paranormal activity is real because I've experienced things that can only be explained as paranormal. Now, this is sort of counterfeit reasoning, right? There's no real logic presented. This statement can be undone by just simply asking why. Quite apart from how people feel about paranormal activity, the way that this is framed probably indicates it's false. Another fallacy is the either-or fallacy. This limits the audience choices to two artificially manipulated views. And here's an example. I didn't see you at church today. I thought you were a good person. This allows for no other input. Either one was at church or one is a bad person. And there are other frequencies of how that can work out. It doesn't mean you're a bad person if you didn't go to church for one day. Okay, that's why that doesn't work. It's an artificially limited field of choices. Another is the ad hominem. This is an attack on the person rather than the argument made by the person. And here's an example. All of my least favorite politicians' statements are wrong because she or he's a creep. This is attacking the person rather than the argument. So when you attack the person, you probably have lost the argument. Another fallacy is the ad populum. Ad populum is a Latin term that just states that assuming a proposition is valid because it's popular, right? Populum, popular. And assuming a proposition is valid because it's popular is not logical. It's very possible that people believe things on sort of a viral basis that are untrue. Every urban legend is probably an ad populum fallacy in a way, right? Or at least many of them are. One example is my friends think vaccines are dangerous. Therefore, I won't vaccinate my kids. Now, this is similar to the hasty generalization. Even though there's more than one person's view presented, there's no statistical power in this statement. There's no real sample. There's no real logic here. So we've seen that persuasion, when it is effective, uses sound reasoning to appeal to the higher emotions of an informed audience, while ineffective persuasion or manipulation distorts issues by manipulating negative emotions in a deceived audience. Avoiding fallacy, providing accurate information, and allowing the audience to use their innate reasonability will ensure effective persuasion and will strengthen your work. So if you would like more contact on these concepts that we've discussed, and if you'd like to strengthen the persuasive aspects of your work, you can come and see us at the Writing, Reading, and Speech Assistance area. You can contact us from our webpage by going to the COD homepage and just typing WRSA into the search bar. And you can see in the red field there that you can schedule a face-to-face or online appointment. You'll be asked just a series of about 5 questions or so that will get you registered with us, and then you can actually make an appointment to see us either face-to-face or online. So thank you for using this resource. We appreciate it. I hope it's been helpful. I hope you have a great day.